All right, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for the Forward in Energy Forum. My name is Allison Bender. I'm the Outreach Coordinator at the Wisconsin Energy Institute here at UW-Madison. We're really glad to see you all today. The Wisconsin Energy Institute's mission is to provide leadership on campus for multidisciplinary research, education, and outreach efforts that accelerate the world's transition to a clean energy system. This forum is our monthly series that brings together experts both on and off campus to explore important technical, social, political, and economic dimensions of a wide variety of clean energy topics. We're really glad you're here today. Before we get into today's session on carbon dioxide removal, I have a few announcements. First, we want to acknowledge the land that WEI occupies, as well as all of UW-Madison, and acknowledge that it's the ancestral home of the Ho-Chunk people, who've called this land Daejeop since time immemorial. We recognize and respect the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation and the 11 other Native nations that reside within the boundaries of what we now call Wisconsin. As we discuss energy and climate solutions in the conversation today, we want to emphasize how tribal nations in Wisconsin and around the world are leading the transition towards clean and just energy systems. We're closing out Native American Heritage Month this week, but we all still have another opportunity to participate in UW's Native November. This year's Native November keynote speaker is Dallas Goldtooth. He's an environmental activist and performing artist. Please consider checking out Goldtooth's keynote this Thursday at 7 p.m. at the Gordon Dining Center. We'll put a link in the chat for that. We'd also like to announce a conference happening next Tuesday on the circular bioeconomy. If you'd like to learn about strategies for sustainable and healthy agricultural landscapes in Wisconsin and connect with other stakeholders in the space, this may be the event for you. We're just taking registrations for the online portion, but the link is in the chat. And then finally, our newest podcast, What's Up Wisconsin, is continuing to release a few more new episodes that break down complex energy technologies and topics. You can find the episodes on our website or anywhere that you get your podcasts. And then finally, a couple logistical notes. Today, after the panelists give their opening remarks, we'll have some time for Q&A. At any time as questions come to you, please submit them in the Q&A box, and then you can also upvote other attendees' questions there. If you'd like captioning, you can toggle that feature on by clicking on the Show Captions button. If you have any other technical concerns, just let us know in the chat. To moderate today's panel and set the stage for the discussion, I'm pleased to introduce Madeline Bindel, who is a PhD student in Environment and Resources. Madeline's research uses integrated assessment models to understand the scale-up potential, policy implications, and equity impacts of negative emissions technologies. As a longtime Badger, Madeline earned her MS in Environment and Resources in 2022 and BS in Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences in 2019 from UW-Madison. Thanks for moderating today, Madeline.
Thanks, Allison, and thank you everybody for joining. As Allison mentioned, my name is Maddie, and I'm in the Environment and Resources program here at UW-Madison. And I thought before we jump into our conversation of today, we could start with a brief primer as to what CDR technologies are and what role they could play in climate change moving forward. So I will share my screen right now and we can go from there. Allison, can we see this okay?
That looks great.
Awesome. So for those of us who might not be as familiar, CDR technologies, or carbon dioxide removal, is basically the process of extracting carbon dioxide, which is primarily a product of fossil fuel combustion, from the atmosphere and permanently storing it. And there are a lot of different storage methods for CO2. One is geological storage, so storing carbon deep underground in things like gas and oil reservoirs that are emptied. Terrestrial storage, so trees taking in carbon dioxide and storing them for long periods of time. Different ocean methods for carbon storage. And then you can also store CO2 in products like cement, which Rob might explain a little bit about today. And a couple key things to keep in mind when we talk about CDR is that it captures CO2 from non-point sources. So as I mentioned, the atmosphere as a whole. This is different from something that you might have heard of in the climate change conversation called carbon capture and sequestration. which is focused on capturing emissions from point sources or specific facilities before they enter the atmosphere. And so another thing to keep in mind with carbon dioxide removal is that we're focused on long-term storage. So this is different from something like carbon capture and utilization that you might have heard of, which uses the carbon that is captured for things like carbonating beverages or using carbon in different industrial processes, and therefore is a more temporary form of storage. Carbon dioxide removal is focused on taking those carbon concentrations from the atmosphere and storing them for a long period of time. And CDR is currently growing and developing. There are a lot of different methods, both natural and technological. And so just to name a few of them that are currently in the conversation of climate change, we have afforestation and reforestation, which is either replacing forested lands or expanding forested lands. We have bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration, or BECCS, which is the process of turning crops into energy and then capturing and storing those resulting emissions. We have biochar and other soil methods, which is focused on enhancing soils with carbon, another way of storing it. We have enhanced weathering, which is another natural process that speeds up weathering. We have different ocean methods, such as ocean fertilization. And then finally, we have a direct air carbon capture and storage, or DACS, which is the process of removing carbon from the atmosphere directly and storing it deep underground. And all of these methods, whether they be new or proven, will likely play a large role in international climate policy targets moving forward. So, for example, in 2015, over 190 countries agreed to an international treaty on climate change, the Paris Agreement. And the main goal of this agreement was to limit global warming to 1.5 or well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And so with this big goal in mind, meeting these targets will require deep mitigation of CO2 emissions. And so a lot of countries, majority of the countries that signed the agreement, have set net zero emissions targets by mid or late century to achieve these goals. And right now we're making progress when it comes to deploying CDR. We currently have 2 gigatons of CDR out there in the world. There's mostly conventional land-based CDR that makes up about 99.9%. And then we have 0.1% from novel and more technology-based CDR methods. But unfortunately, even with this proposed and currently operating CDR, we're not on track to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And so it's important that CDR scales up, and this process will require a lot of policy support. So with that, I will introduce our experts that we have on our panel today. I'll introduce them all at once and then give them each about 5 minutes or so to give their opening remarks, and then we'll start into the Q&A session. So first we have Dr. Greg Nemeth, who is a professor of public affairs here at UW-Madison. His research focuses on understanding the process of technological change and the ways in which public policy can affect it. He published a book in 2019 titled How Solar Energy Became Cheap, a Model for Low Carbon Innovation, and was awarded the inaugural World Citizen Prize in Environmental Performance that same year. Greg is also currently a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th Assessment Report. Next up, we have Emily Grubert, who is an associate professor of sustainable energy policy in the Civil Environmental Engineering and Earth Sciences Department at Notre Dame. Her research focuses on justice-oriented deep decarbonization and decision support tools related to large infrastructure systems, with an emphasis on evaluation of dynamic life cycle socio-environmental impacts and the effects of different value systems on decision pathways. She holds a PhD in environment resources from Stanford and has previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Carbon Management, as well as Senior Advisor for Energy Asset Transformation at the U.S. Department of Energy. We also have Rob Annex on our panel today, who is a professor of biological systems engineering here at UW-Madison. Rob is an expert in life cycle assessment and systems modeling, particularly as it applies to decarbonization technologies and bio-based products. His research currently focuses on perspective analysis of the economic and environmental impacts of policies and technologies in a changing global environment. And along with Dr. Bu Wang, he is a co-founder of the Earth Repair Global Incorporated, a carbon capture and mineralization company based on a technology developed here at UW-Madison. And then finally in our panel today, we have Dr. Holly Buck, who is an assistant professor of environment and sustainability at the University at Buffalo. She is an environmental social scientist whose research focuses on public engagement with emerging climate and energy technologies. She's the author of the books After Geoengineering and Ending Fossil Fuels, Why Net Zero is Not Enough, and holds a PhD in development sociology from Cornell. So welcome, everyone. I will hand it over to our panelists. Maybe we can start with Greg Nemeth, just to share a little bit about their work and give some opening remarks. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Maddie, and also a very thorough overview of some of the dimensions of carbon removal. So I would just start by reiterating a couple of things that Maddie said. One is just the trajectory, where it all of a sudden seems like carbon dioxide removal is a important, talked about topic with a lot of investment behind it. And I think Maddie kind of put it well that the 2015 Paris Agreement 8 years ago really kicked off the need for CDR by talking about a temperature target where we had to get temperature well below 2 degrees and make efforts for 1.5 degrees. That led to the special report on 1.5 because we didn't have a lot of integrated assessment models that could ever get to 1.5. So how could we do it? And that was the focus of that report. And what comes out of that report is we need to get to net zero by mid-century for 2050. And that to do that requires a substantial amount of removals of CO2 that are already in the atmosphere. And as Maddie said, after that, countries listened. And within 3 or 4 years, we have 85% of emissions happening in countries with a mid-century net zero target. So it's been a dramatic change and trajectory. I guess the main takeaways, I'll show a couple of slides, but mainly the main takeaways I would say is the first most important thing is that we, regardless of what we do on CDR, how much we do, we still need to do 80 or 90% emissions reductions by mid-century to meet our Paris Agreement temperature target. And so that means immediate and deep reductions, and whether we have CDR or not really doesn't change that. It changes whether we do 90% or 100%, but that makes no difference in terms of our actions today. So the urgency of reducing emissions doesn't change with what we do on CDR. Second, why is there a need? Why do we need CDR if we're going to be doing so much effort on emissions reductions? It's really 3 things. It's the Paris Agreement, where 1.5 is a goal. It's where we are today, 1.2, which means we're likely to have some overshoot and need to come back down. So you need removal to come back down from wherever we get to. And 3, there probably are some emissions that are just so difficult or costly to get out of the system that we have to remove what we're adding. And so for those 3 reasons, we need CDR. And one of the things that Maddie showed was the carbon removal gap from the State of CDR report. That's where we estimated the difference between how much CDR we will need for 1.5 and 2 degrees and how much are in countries' nationally determined contributions, which they'll be discussing at COP28 over the next couple of weeks. And we see a gap on the order of multiple gigatons, so on the order of 10% of emissions between what we would be doing with policies in place and what we need with scenarios. So substantial need to scale up CDR, and that's what a lot of my group works on, is how could we do that? How feasible is that? And as Maddie showed, there are a variety of methods needed for CDR. And what we see is that all of those come with risks. And so a diverse portfolio of different avenues for removing CDR is probably the most societally beneficial. So I'll just take another minute or two to just show kind of where some of these results come from, mostly so that you can find them on your own. These come out of, as Maddie said, from some of the IPCC work I did in the sex assessment report. Second, from the state of carbon dioxide removal, a report we released last January. And then a new chapter on carbon dioxide removal that we wrote in the UNEP emissions gap report that came out last week. So I'll just put a couple of those results up for a couple minutes here. So first, what does the IPCC say on carbon dioxide removal? Well, here's the big takeaway from the summaries for policymakers. This is what's agreed on, not just what scientists are saying. This is what 190 countries agree on, that CDR is unavoidable if net zero CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions are to be achieved. So strong wording from IPCC on that. Second, this is to make the point that if you look at this graph, this is where we need to go to meet Paris temperature target. Almost all of it is emissions reduction. So that's got to be the priority, but we can't get to 1.5 and 2 degrees without doing some removal. That's the negative part here, and that's on the order of gigatons. This is the diversity of approaches, and Maddie already talked about that, but it's an expanding list and a really diverse set of approaches, all of which have challenges. And this is one definitely is for your future reference, but I think it's a good summary of the risks and the potentials of these different carbon dioxide removals. They differ in terms of how long the CO2 is expected or the carbon's expected to stay out of the atmosphere. They differ how long or what the impacts could be. They differ in terms of how much potential there is in terms of gigatons, and then some of the side effects on ecosystems, on people, on water, and other issues as well. So that's a good slide from the sixth assessment report to take a look at when you have time to digest it. And then just last, I can't help but highlight that we have a new carbon dioxide removal chapter in the UNEP GAP report, in part because I think this is my favorite report cover of all time, and so it's fun to be able to show that. But you know, it's a bad news report in terms of it being the same story and also temperature records being broken. But I think this middle one kind of is probably the best attempt we've been able to say about how much carbon dioxide removal we'll need. And here, if you focus on the middle, so that's 1.5 degrees, that means we need net zero CO2 by mid-century, around 2050. And with these numbers, we have to get from about 55 CO2 equivalent gigatons today down to close to zero, such that the only emissions we have in 2050 are non-CO2 gases. That's why we have the 6.8 there. But the bottom line is that looks like 3.6 gigatons of land-based carbon dioxide removal and almost twice that of novel CDR. And the thing about land-based is we're already doing a lot of it. And the thing about novel CDR is we're doing almost none of it. There's a lot of investment, but there's no scale yet. And so that is all about a challenge of scale up. So I'll leave you with a link to our State of CDR report that I hope those of you who are interested in can follow up on. We'll be doing a new second version of it that will release this June. So stay tuned on what we have as the latest there. So looking forward to what the rest of the panelists have to say into your questions as well.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Greg. I thought next up we could have Emily Grubert give her opening remarks.
Great. Thanks, Maddie, and thanks everybody for being here tonight. It's always fun to have a chance to talk about stuff related to CDR. One of the things that I wanted to kick us off with, and also, like Greg said, looking forward to the questions and the discussion, is really why we don't think about CDR as something that we can use to substitute for emissions reductions. It's kind of the classic mitigation first, then removal conversation that we have quite frequently, and is part of the reason why residual emissions are such a conversation. Like basically, how many emissions do we have going forward that we actually need to counteract with CDR? One of the big reasons for really caring about doing avoidance and emissions mitigation before we move on to carbon dioxide removal is just that CDR is really resource intensive. And as a result of being resource intensive, it's actually also limited. So we think about sometimes CDR as being something that we can do kind of extensively and as much as we want to, just because there's so much CO2 in the atmosphere. but the CO2 piece of it isn't often what is actually limiting our ability to deploy these things. So this is kind of the question of, well, why can't we just plant a ton of trees, or why can't we just do a lot of CDR to avoid doing emissions cuts somewhere else in cases where we do have the opportunity to cut them? And depending on the approach that we're talking about, the story is a little bit different, but in general, all CDR approaches have some kind of resource limitation. For the biologically based things, a lot of the time, it's really about the reservoir, so how you're storing the CO2. With regard to trees in particular, you end up in a situation where effectively the wood, and some stuff in the soil as well, but effectively the wood is what's storing the CO2. So if you're using that as a CDR mechanism, you do use up quite a lot of land and essentially devote that land to being in CDR permanently. Some of the estimates that people have put forward for some of the biological approaches to CDR suggest that this resource probably is limited to kind of one good shot at on the order of less than 10 gigatons in general, just in terms of storage. And it does require permanent land dedication to CDR in many cases. When we start to think about other technologies, so direct air capture and similar resources, probably the big limiting resource in those cases is energy. And again, in thinking about where we actually are trying to cut down residual emissions and really trying to avoid as much as we can, part of the reason for that is that taking a very, very low concentration gas out of the atmosphere is actually difficult. So if you're doing that with direct air capture, you're going to be using huge amounts of energy. One of the kind of big studies that looks at how much CO2 removal you might need in the United States by mid-century for net zero suggests a range that would imply that we'd be using more electricity for CDR than we use for any single sector in the country now by the middle of the century. And similarly, looking at some of the global impacts and estimates of even fairly minimal CDR, we could maybe expect to be using about as much electricity as the entire world uses now just to power DAC in some of these scenarios. And so that's one of the really big reasons why we don't really think about CDR as being available to substitute for emissions reductions, but rather there for the emissions that we cannot get rid of otherwise. So that's a really big part of why we care about reduction first. It's also something that has a lot of implications for how we think about infrastructure. So putting a direct air capture facility also means developing a lot more energy generation infrastructure. Putting an enhanced rock weathering facility means a lot of rock extraction, stuff like this. And in most cases, there are these additional infrastructural burdens that are possible to do, but it's not a situation where we really have infinite access to CDR. So essentially precious resource that has a lot of really important functions. So offsetting ongoing emissions, but also potentially atmospheric restoration with drawing down CO2 emissions eventually. So preserving what limited resources that we have to really apply to situations where we need them is pretty important. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Emily. Next up, let's have Rob Annex give his opening remarks.
All right. Yeah, so I'm representing that DAC that Emily just talked about. I'm the co-founder, along with Bu Wong, of a direct air capture company called Earth Repair that's commercializing a technology developed at UW-Madison that uses waste materials to capture CO2 and store it in a mineral form that can displace Portland cement. So I want to be sure and say, as the developer of a DAC technology, we don't want to be the excuse for anybody not to reduce emissions. Greg gave us sort of a positive spin. I mean, the US produced record amounts of oil and natural gas last year, and we're on track to set another record this year. And we're the world's largest exporter of natural gas. We need to reduce emissions before we rely on CDR and DAC. But as Emily and Greg pointed out, we will need it. So I don't want to be anybody's excuse, but let me tell you a little bit about it. And as technology developers, we have to convince our board of investors and potential other investors that there's a business case and that money can be made. And shareholders and stakeholders, of course, require transparency, and if they're going to grant permission for CDR to be done. And so markets require trust and confidence. And from a societal standpoint, to get to a level of CDR that we need, we'll also need to attract a really huge amount of private capital, private investment. And that requires transparency and markets that people can trust and have confidence in. And capturing CO2 is really, really hard. CO2 is invisible, it's odorless, and we're asking people to pay us to remove it from the air and store it for a really, really long period of time. So it's really a challenge to build trust and confidence in that kind of an enterprise. And so I want to, if I can, share my screen and show you a little bit about how, hopefully that's working. This is a general slide about, carbon capture. All the technologies that are engineered, that I think they are called sometimes novel CDR technologies, are using some kind of a sorbent to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. And that sorbent has to be regenerated, right? So it captures this very little bits of CO2 out of the air, and then you have to regenerate it. So you desorb the CO2. And to do that, you use a bunch of energy, right? Then your sorbent can go back over here and capture more CO2. Then that CO2 gas has to go and, for the purposes of this talk, get put somewhere permanently, like geological storage or used to mineralize natural minerals. And that takes a bunch of energy too, right? The gaseous CO2 has to be compressed and pushed down a pipeline and injected in the ground. So as was said by Emily, if this energy is energy out of the grid that's producing a bunch of CO2, you can very easily get yourself into a position where you're emitting more CO2 in generating this energy than you're capturing over here on the left side. And there are a number of DAC companies that have built their business plan around the idea that there will be very large amounts of low-cost, low-carbon energy that'll make this work. And that's not obviously true. So there's a real resource constraint. And also then you're competing with other decarbonization enterprises for that clean energy, right? So that energy might do more good somewhere else where you're displacing either dirty energy or other high carbon intense activities. So what we do, which of course, like Greg wants to show you the cover of his report, I want to show you what we do that we think addresses a number of these things, but still has a number of limitations that have been mentioned that we don't think it's the cure-all. We just think it's going to be a nice way to meet some of our need for CDR through DAC. So this is just a quick cartoon of what we do. We use a waste material like coal ash or steel slag or natural minerals, mafic minerals, and we put them into a reactor at atmospheric temperature and pressure. And I kind of have to jump over to, we have a sorbent that captures CO2 out of the atmosphere and it's an alkaline material. When that carbonated alkaline material comes back in this reactor, we carbonate some of the materials in this mineral. And so we make a carbonated residue. So the CO2 becomes carbonate in this material directly, and it is permanently sequestered. And it was all done at atmospheric temperature and pressure. So we don't have that big energy of regenerating a sorbent, nor do we have a lot of energy to then sequester the CO2. And the added bonus is that this material can displace Portland cement, which is a carbon intense production activity, and we get even more carbon savings there. So we think we address a number of the resource constraints, but still, right? I mean, still scaling this up to, you've heard numbers on the order of 10 gigatons. There's a huge amount of investment required. There's a huge amount. These will be a large number of very large facilities that will require resources, and those resources come with a carbon burden. So I want to just say a couple of words about, carbon credits, carbon offsets. This sort of selling these carbon credits has always, for a long time, struggled to inspire confidence. Recently, we've seen a lot of publicity about forest-based offsets. Let me unshare my screen. Not necessarily doing what they want, and that market has sort of collapsed. The prices have been reduced on the order of 75 or 80%. And and for the first time in 7 years, the carbon credit markets have actually shrunk in the last year. But as was mentioned, DAC, I think, is unavoidable, as the IPCC says, and we really can't let it distract from reducing emissions, and we can't allow companies to appear to take climate action by claiming to do DAC or CDR when in reality they're not cutting emissions. But steep emission reductions are absolutely necessary, and we will need technologies that can provide additionality, permanence, and build confidence in the carbon markets. So the investments that are needed to build the CDR capacity that's required, as Greg mentioned, is very large, will be made in a timely manner. We're behind in reducing emissions, but we're also way behind in fielding CDR. And I think that's where I will stop. Thank you.
Wonderful, Rob. Thanks so much. Last but not least, we have Holly Buck.
Great. Hello. Wonderful to be with you. I am going to share a couple of slides. And I wanted to talk about two things in particular. The first is ocean carbon removal, if you can see this, just because sometimes it gets left out. And then I want to talk about what are we really doing to encourage this industry, both in terms of government policy and in what the private sector is doing. So a lot in 5 minutes, but just to get the conversation going in those directions. Basically, there's a bunch of ocean carbon removal methods, as were mentioned. And this 2021 report by the National Academies assesses them. Some of them are more biological based, like cultivating algae that would then sink to the bottom of the sea. Some are more industrial in their flavor, such as electrochemical methods or ocean alkalinity enhancement. But the main point I want to highlight is that these are all in really early stages of research. And that research involves, in some cases, simply do these things work to remove carbon? What are the ecological impacts to these ecosystems? And can we really track where that carbon is going? So why ocean carbon removal? People are interested in this because of, in part, some of the limitations that you heard about from the other speakers, but also just because the oceans already are a huge reservoir of carbon. They're taking up a lot of the carbon that's in the atmosphere. It's an obvious opportunity. And in some ways, they could be more efficient than capturing CO2 from the air. So there's companies like this rendering of a hypothetical facility by the firm Captura that are looking at direct ocean capture. There's other companies like Running Tide, which is looking at dispersing these buoys that would grow macroalgae, kind of trying to work with nature to do that. So exciting area of research. I do want to highlight that these ocean carbon removal methods, they're not just something that happens out there in the ocean. They do have land-based components and will affect people on land. For example, ocean alkalinity enhancement, the idea of putting kind of ground up minerals into the sea, will have a supply chain that involves mining, transportation, processing on land. And so all of these things do have different stakeholder communities across the supply chains that it will be important to engage if these industries scale up. And there's been a lot of work done on this, especially on the idea of responsible research and innovation. What are the principles? Is there a code of conduct for researchers? Really, seriously, years of research. And you can read some of the reports and papers on this, but they talk about things like international law, being aligned with the precautionary principle, making sure everything is transparent, doing engagement, and making sure the distribution of benefits and costs is equitable. So that is growing in discussion, but we'll see how it gets operationalized. I want to switch to talking about policy. So we do have something in this administration through the Department of Energy called the carbon negative shot. Basically, it's an attempt to support carbon removal at $100 per ton or less within a decade. And so they recognize that multiple CDR approaches need to be investigated. So what is the government doing to support this goal? A few things. There's a pretty small but interesting purchasing program. It's the first of a kind of thing, $35 million for these 4 different pathways that would be basically setting up these offtake agreements with people who will be able to supply these removals. There's also these carbon negative shot pilots, including marine CDR, but also other methods. So that's one thing. There's different agencies involved in this. It's not just the Department of Energy. NOAA has put some funding into ocean CDR, ARPA-E, USDA, of course, with a lot of research in terms of climate smart commodities, programming in that area, Forest Service, et cetera. So multi-agency effort. You've probably heard about some of these signature pieces of legislation, like the bipartisan infrastructure law, which got a lot of attention for these direct air capture hubs, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, which could potentially support a lot more CDR research. At the same time, the private sector has been accelerating their commitment to this. So there's been this big advanced market commitment to buy an initial $1 billion worth of permanent carbon removal. Some of the largest tech firms in the world are participating in that. So what are all these people actually trying to do? This is my last slide. First, just to underscore that ocean CDR, and I would say all CDR, but especially some of these frontier methods need more research. Right now, I think there's some kind of confusion about whether the aim of all this federal funding and private sector funding is really meant to be building these new infrastructures. In the clean energy space, we talk about rapid deployment. Is that really what we're trying to do? Or are we really in the space of trying to provide startups and researchers with funding to figure out what actually works and how to improve? Is this really a strategy of innovation policy focused on learning? So I would say that in my view, most people seem to understand this to be the latter, just because we don't have a real policy framework for deploying massive carbon removal infrastructures. There's a gap here between this innovation stage activity and the idea of actually having regulation that would compel the removal of billions of tons of greenhouse gases. And so in my opinion, more clarity on what the aims really are at this stage would really help research get done. And I'll leave it there. Looking forward to our discussion.
Wonderful, Holly. Thanks so much. All right, so I see a couple questions in the chat already, but please, everyone, feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A box, but I'll kick us off with a couple of my own. So all of you have mentioned in some way, shape, or form that CDR is not just a benefit, it is a necessity in addressing climate change. And so one concern that's often posed by the public and researchers is that the scale up of CDR might inhibit or, I guess, kind of reduce the urgency around phasing out fossil fuels. And so I guess I'm curious, how would you guys address these concerns? And maybe we can start with Greg, who I know does a lot of work in this space.
Yeah, first of all, I'll say it's a valid concern because I've encountered it. I've confronted, or people have made that argument to me that we have these emissions that we want to continue and that we'll just remove them. And so it's definitely a concern because people are making that argument. On the other hand, from a social view or from a global systemic view, it doesn't really make a lot of sense that, say we have the capacity, if we do all of these things that we've just been talking about in the last 20 minutes, and they all work really well, and we're able to do 5 or 10 gigatons by mid-century, we're addressing like 20% of the problem. So it's kind of like saying you have an insurance policy that's going to give you 20% of the value of your house if it burns down. And so you say, well, I don't care, then I can burn my house down. I'll still get 20% back. I don't think most people would really think of CDR as a get out of jail free card or as an insurance policy, because those are the dimensions of the problem. So people are arguing for using CDR because they have narrow interests and want to continue emitting fossil fuels. But from a social perspective, that argument doesn't really make sense. And so to me, it's kind of like, well, do we drop our use of this tool because we don't trust ourselves to control the behavior of those who would make arguments based on really narrow interests? And for me, I don't know, I just feel like I have more confidence in our ability to govern and to hold different entities accountable, rather than say, we don't trust ourselves with this technology, so no CDR. For us, we have to do it all on emissions reduction. So yeah, it's a difficult issue though, and it'll not go away.
No, that's very true. And Holly, I believe you've done some work with what's termed as like a stopgap measure, saying that these are, potentially CDR might be a temporary solution, but we do, as Greg said, need to create long-term mitigation solutions. And so I guess, what are your thoughts on this issue and the classification of CDR as both a solution but also kind of a stepping stone to a longer term mitigation solution?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I work with a lot of colleagues that are focused on mitigation deterrence, and we've been talking about this for years. And I do think my opinions have come to differ from some of my colleagues for a couple of reasons. One is that it's so clear that these systems, to be carbon negative, rely so much on the massive deployment of clean energy that there's just no workaround for that. Like, it's kind of the primary thing. Otherwise, you're not getting the removals. So from a pragmatic point of view, that's why I'm not as concerned about mitigation deterrence from CDR. I'm concerned about mitigation deterrence in terms of different actors and nation states who don't want to phase out fossil fuels. I think that's, clear and present and right in front of us. I think that one question I always have is like, who are these imagined people who are distracted by the shiny promise of CDR? Because in my work with kind of representative members of the public, many of whom have never heard of CDR, I do interviews and focus groups. And immediately when you tell them there's a machine that could take CO2 out of the air, they're like, yeah, that's a fantasy. I don't think that's going to work. What about this? What about that? I think people are a lot more kind of skeptical than we give them credit for. And I think we just kind of don't have a generalized theory about how the attention economy works. So I think that's also a factor in this idea that people will lose focus or lose attention. I do think there's more interesting, both empirical and theoretical work to do in this space. And the last thing I'll say before I wrap up this long comment is that a lot of people have called for separate targets for removals and for reductions of emissions as one way that would help a little bit in addressing this issue.
Definitely, very true. So I guess on the topic of CDR, I know Emily and Rob, you both had mentioned that there is a significant energy input that is required to scale up CDR to the levels needed. And this results in increased electricity generation. And so I was wondering if either or both of you could speak to just what this energy infrastructure transition might look like, and if it is even feasible in our current state.
Yeah, sure thing. I'll talk about this mostly from the perspective of electrically powered DAC. Like, there are other examples where there's energy inputs that you need for kinds of CDR. So enhanced rock weathering, for example, you need to crush the rocks, like things like this. But I think the most salient one is direct air capture, just because the energy input is so obvious. And there's a lot of heat that goes into that as well, which makes some of the how do you do this cleanly conversation get kind of interesting. I think that there's a couple different things going on here. So one, when we think about infrastructure, is basically the far future ideal kinds of outcomes, and people in that context tend to talk about kind of the co-development of a couple of technologies that we don't really see deployed right now. So this is things like deploying direct air capture in concert with geothermal power that is really associated with providing both electricity and heat directly, or potentially coupling it with small modular reactors on the nuclear side or something like that. Both of those technologies are still emergent. So this is kind of a big technical risk kind of a thing, but potentially very well suited to each other as we think about sort of mid-century and beyond. The other version of this is really kind of using the same kinds of things that we see as really powering a lot of the rest of the decarbonization of the systems that we have. So like Holly says, there's a very clear need to use clean energy to do this if you're actually going to get the maximum removals that you're looking for. But in those situations, I think there's a little bit of a tendency to overlook how much additional infrastructure this might be. So I see people talking occasionally about, you know, we could use just the curtailed solar in the middle of the day that nobody is using to run CDR or DAC facilities specifically. That's probably not the case, just in terms of how much power we're actually talking about. And so this means probably, depending on how big of a system you're looking at, a couple of more terawatts of electricity capacity to really support a lot of this infrastructure. And I think one of the things that comes up for me a lot in thinking about what are really the upper boundaries of how much DAC we could deploy is thinking about how much electricity we could deploy. We think about deep decarbonization. A lot of net zero models for the US, for example, suggest that we probably need a system that's somewhere between 5 and 8 times the size that it currently is. And so when you think about going from a system where we have kind of 10% of our primary energy from modern renewables up to something where we have 500 to 800% of our system coming from modern renewables, those marginal ones at the end that you're maybe having to add to provide more DAC, I'm not convinced are cheaper than the ones we're adding now. And so you start to really start thinking about what those costs look like, what the additional land burden might be, that kind of thing. Yeah. Long story short, if you have very, very cheap electricity, you're probably talking about minimum costs for DAC of $60 a ton or so just for the energy inputs. If you can't have that absolute bottom cheapest power, you get past $100 very quickly.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I think Emily had all the right numbers and all the right facts. You know, there are some, as we're building out, there are some isolated cases. There was an item in the news about in Tracy, California, Heirloom, who is a company that does mineralization, opened the first commercial plant in the US. And California happens to be a place where there's a lot of wind and solar power that is renewable, obviously, but it would rapidly be exported somewhere if our transmission network would allow it, right? So we have a huge problem of building enough transmission to take the renewable energy where it you know, has a huge generation potential to where the markets are, and so at least in the short term, DAC can go to some of those pockets where there's an opportunity, but that doesn't work in the long run. And the technologies that require really large amounts of power are not scalable. I mean, Emily had all the right numbers, thinking about factor of 5 or 8 of our current generation and transmission network, right? That's especially in the time frame we're talking about. I don't know the numbers very well, but you know, we're suddenly talking about trillions of dollars that, you know, exceed the GDP of the world in, you know, in the time frame we're talking about.
No, absolutely. That figure struck me too, the 500 to 800%. But thank you both for your input on that topic. We do have a couple questions from audience members that popped in while we were chatting. One says, how much carbon removal could be achieved by restoring ecosystems both on land and in the ocean? So Holly, maybe we can send that one to you first, since you do a lot on ocean CDR.
You know, I don't have the exact number from the ecosystem restoration, but I can look it up and paste it in the chat pretty quickly. I'll just say that the number was pretty small compared to the other ocean CDR approaches, but it also has a lot of important co-benefits. So it's like we shouldn't just measure these approaches based on the tonnage alone. We need to also think about other social aims.
Absolutely. Anyone else have any thoughts or input on the topic?
Well, I mean, one thing I would just add is the potential for any one CDR method, whether it's oceans or a particular type of blue carbon in oceans, or those are really, really uncertain now. And some colleagues and I did a review like 5 years ago, and it just the ranges were huge, and it still seems like the ranges are huge. DAC is probably one where the range is biggest. So potentially really high upside, but some of the issues that Emily talked about become constraining factors. So there do seem like quite a few methods, like on the order of 8 to 10 methods, where you could reasonably say there's a gigaton of removal capacity, and then you go up from there, depending on how much land you're willing to convert or energy you're willing to use, or other impacts that you're willing to deal with. But yeah, it's a good open question about how much potential there really is.
And as an engineer, it's dangerous for me to wade into this topic, but I have noticed that, Canada, even though they have lots of heavy industry, mining, extractive industries, they've always had a pretty easy time meeting carbon goals because of all their forests. And as of a few years ago, they realized that the forests have now become net sources of carbon. As climate change affects the trees, and this was not even counting the huge fires of a couple of years ago, but trees start dying, the environment changes, and there are more pests, and trees that are the standing stock of carbon decompose, and suddenly you're moving the wrong direction. All of that to say, restoring natural ecosystems becomes way more challenging. So the uncertainty that Greg mentioned, I think, is huge, because you don't just restore the forest that was there. Now you have to plant new trees because it's a different climate, and they have to be, it's not easy to know how to do it, much less how exactly how much carbon we would benefit.
This is a little bit of a soapbox thing for me, but really, really quickly, I think one of the big challenges with carbon dioxide removal in general is accounting. And frankly, with a lot of the ecosystem restoration stuff, I would argue probably most of that is mitigation first, mitigating the carbon storage that we've lost from the system due to human intervention. And so really, by the time you're really doing removals in a true atmospheric sense, you're probably beyond the restoration stage. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but it's probably not removal.
No, that's a very good point. And I guess that makes me curious. Is there some ideal ratio or balance of natural solutions? Because Emily, you mentioned that there's a lot of land use implications of those versus more technology-based solutions, which, both Rob and Emily and others have mentioned have significant energy input implications. Is there an ideal balance of nature-based to technology-based CDR that we're trying to approach in the future, or is it whatever works, a certain combination?
I know people have really different opinions about this, but I think one of the things that I'll just put out as my own is that a lot of the time when we're talking about true removals that you could use to, say, counterbalance a prior emission, you're probably talking about biologically based industrial processes. And I think one of the conversations we often have is very much around, well, nature-based solutions are much more natural, they're good for the planet and these kinds of things. But a lot of the time, if we're talking about forestry projects or other things in that vein, you're probably talking about basically industrial silviculture, so like tree farms. A lot of the time, it's not necessarily the case that you're doing something that is super oriented around the nature restoration. That is something that we should do for other reasons, probably. Like to Holly's point, there are co-benefits of that. Turning that entirely, like ecological restoration, entirely into a commoditized carbon market pathway, I think is a little dangerous in a lot of ways. But when we talk about nature-based solutions in true carbon dioxide removal context, I think it is important that people have the image in their head that this isn't necessarily like a beautiful mature forest that is where it was meant to be. It's probably something that looks a lot more like tree farms and alternative agricultural practices.
And I completely agree with that, but I always feel like pointing out, and Holly may have something to say about this, that decline in the sort of nature-based solutions affects the poorer nations, right? They're the places where funds can flow from multinational companies to lesser developed countries that aren't going to be making DAC, right? But they can plant trees and do some nature-based solutions. And create local development. Now there may be reasons why you don't want to. You want to make sure you're doing the accounting that Emily mentioned in the first place, so that you know you're actually getting real carbon capture. But it is one way to address equity more than some of these other technologies.
No, that is very true. It's a very important consideration.
Yeah, and I would just chime in with an argument for a diverse portfolio of CDR approaches, because they all have risks, and a lot of those risks are unknown, including how big they could actually be, how much water they would take, how much biodiversity they would impact, how governance works, how monitoring really works, how climate change affects these. So to me, it's not a question of balancing natural versus engineered. It's that we've got a lot of uncertain technologies, and we probably want to develop and put effort into testing them and starting to scale them up, and then, you know, see what works after that. So that's an argument for a diverse portfolio of uncertain outcomes.
I don't want to stop you from going to another question, but that was the question you asked lets me get on one of my favorite soapboxes, which is, you know, I'll channel being an economist. We don't want to choose what the optimum mix is, right? If we had well, first we need Emily's accounting so we know what we're getting. But if we had a carbon market, the markets could sort that out for us, right? In my field, if you under the Inflation Reduction Act, you can get paid for doing carbon removal. And that sounds great. And I will be happy if we can get some of that money. But a company that's getting subsidized can then do things, you know, they may use a lot of energy, and with that subsidy, they can go out and compete for that energy, and the whole market gets skewed, right? Whereas if we had a carbon price, which I know is sort of politically non-starter at this point, but if we had a real carbon market, a lot of the maximizing utility would happen for itself, right? Efficiency would be gained from the market, not from us trying to pick winners and losers and who to subsidize.
That's a great point. And on the topic of a diverse portfolio and different technological innovations, one audience question was, how hopeful are you that technological innovations, for example, MOFs, could be real game changers? Or are primary challenges policy related, for example, carbon markets, to incentivize the scale up of technologies we already have working at the lab or pilot scale? So, Rob, I know that deals a lot with your work at the technology level. Maybe you could kick us off.
What's an MOF?
That is a great question. I don't know if we can.
Metal Organic Frameworks.
There you go. Perfect. That's why we have a panel of experts. Awesome.
You know, I was thinking that might be what it was, but yeah, well, I'm not sure quite where to go with that. I think, as was mentioned earlier, that the policies we have in place now, I understand them to be, and I think they are largely to incentivize innovation and, you know, pre-startup and startup. And I think that's great. But then, as I said, you really need to have markets, whether it is a carbon market or an offset market, and those markets have to be transparent. And people have to have trust in them and confidence in them, or the resources will never flow there. So there clearly is a place where policy needs to, time is so short, we need to do both of those things. I mean, normally I think we would be doing the innovation and the early development first. And I think Greg probably has lots to say about this. And then we would shift off into deploy, and creating carbon markets. I think we're in a position where we're sort of doing that, build the airplane while we fly, and we don't have time to dawdle. So I think we need all these things.
Yeah, maybe just to build on Rob's comment. Yeah, it seems like we definitely don't have what's sometimes called a dominant design in any of these areas where, okay, we've figured out, like with wind turbines, it used to be, we weren't sure if we needed 2 blades or 3 blades or 6 blades. Became pretty clear at some point that 3 was better, and that a horizontal axis was better, and upwind of the turbine of the tower was better. And if you think about something for DAC, we've got lots of different ways to capture chemically CO2 and regenerate whatever the sorbent or solvent is. So, and maybe we have many of those that continue on, but we probably don't have dozens and 100 different ways to do DAC because we need to get to scale and there's benefits to concentration. So I think that's part of where we are right now. But the other thing about that question is we've talked about 2050 and needing gigatons by 2050. But if you look at the longer term beyond that, there we talk about actually probably have to be net negative because of overshoot. And so then you have even bigger amounts of carbon removal. And to do the bigger amounts, we probably do need things like synthetic biology to engineer roots of grasses or engineer trees or do something with soils to do a lot more retention of carbon in them, and similarly for membranes or materials or things for DAC. So I think there really is space for some of these longer term fundamental technologies, but they may not be needed for the the first generation, the first gigaton maybe of removal for novel CDR.
No, very true. It is important to consider both the near and long-term impacts of these technologies. And so on that subject, one of our audience questions is asking about specifically direct air capture. And they say, I've heard about a new direct air capture plant being built in Texas with some concerns about DAC infrastructure being built in communities that have already been overburdened by existing fossil fuel and energy systems or experiencing other environmental injustices. And so they're curious what is being done to ensure that CDR approaches have equity and justice centered in their work. And so I know Holly and Emily, you guys do some work surrounding this. Maybe you can kick us off.
Sure. So I think that there's a lot of work being done in different spaces by different people. I think that a lot of community-based organizations and also national environmental and environmental justice groups are paying some attention to this among all their many priorities. And I think that the federal government has some bit of leeway over projects that they help fund, but that's not going to be all the projects. Some of them are going to be just funded by the project sector, and then the government won't have as much leeway in terms of ensuring community benefits. So for projects that are funded through the Department of Energy, those projects have to produce community benefit plans that outline 4 things. They talk about the approach to workforce development. They talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the project and project team. They talk about environmental justice, both in assessing the benefits and the negative impacts, and what is that applicant going to do to address what it finds in that assessment. And it talks about what's their plan for community and stakeholder engagement. And so those plans are scored in merit review, and they're iterated on, and they're developed throughout the project. And so all projects that are going to get this class 6 injection permit to inject CO2 underground. Also, there's some public hearing component to that. Those permits are given via the EPA and their underground injection control program. So that's another opportunity for some input, but it's not necessarily a very meaningful opportunity because that already comes at a later stage of the project. So those are a couple of things set up within both the government's funding processes and regulatory structures. Neither of them are probably adequate to the task at hand. And so some actors in the private sector among these startups are also thinking about how they can educate themselves about how to do these things better. Maybe Emily has more to add to that.
Yeah, thank you, Holly. I think, yeah, it's an interesting space because there's a lot of talk, I think, about what people are doing to ensure this. And this is maybe where I do depart a bit from maybe some of the other panelists and some colleagues too. I actually fundamentally don't think that we can deliver real climate justice and a lot of environmental justice outcomes as well if we allow CDR to develop as a for-profit industry. And basically, there's not any real fundamental controls on any of this. Like when we talk about what is being done, there are regulatory approaches we could take, those types of things. But I think in the long run, what we're seeing is that because CDR is starting to develop as a for-profit industry, albeit one that's mostly publicly funded, the incentive structure is to make this as big as possible. And that's not necessarily super well aligned with some of the equity and justice considerations that people express. I think one of the other really big challenges here is that there's a lot being done on sort of fence line issues. To Holly's point about community engagement and these types of things, it's really about how do you live with this plant that's in your area, and what is it like to host CDR infrastructure and those types of things. It's a fundamentally different piece of thinking about environmental and climate justice than really what the purpose of the plant is. And in the context of a situation where you sort of have CDR being developed and applied to offset emissions that aren't somehow centrally controlled. So basically, if I can go buy CDR, which I do, and like there's challenges associated with that, I am fundamentally choosing what I'm going to apply those to. In a situation where we had something that was much more around waste management or something along those lines, where we kind of decide societally, I know this is easier said than done, but sort of decide societally which emissions are the ones that are kind of allowed to continue, which residual emissions do we actually think are important or need to happen. So, you know, agricultural emissions, maybe some fossil emissions associated with really severe services or something like that. You get to a place where the conversation is really different, just because why you're doing some of these things, I think, matters as much for the justice piece of it as how you're doing it in some cases. And I don't think we're at a place, especially the way this industry is developing so far, where the why is controllable, basically. But yeah, it's a really, really difficult situation for sure.
That's true. Yeah. In so many ways, you know, it's difficult to quantify where, you know, other things like the technology itself, we have numbers associated with it, but justice in itself is a little more, difficult to quantify. So one of these next questions is quantifiable. One of our audience members asks, how close are any of these technologies to get to $100 per ton of carbon or less? If none now, when may they get there? What would be needed? And would this involve technology development or scale up or perhaps something else? So a lot of questions wrapped into one, but feel free to take that as you interpret it.
You're the natural person, Greg. You can put your chart back up.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly an important question, and one that's hard with emerging technologies, because we have maybe 20 direct air capture plants have been built around the world now. So we have some experience, but you know, those are often the first of a kind. So how do you actually spread the costs over one or two different plants of all the research that goes into it, or doing something on a customized basis? So I would expect that the first direct air capture plants are really expensive, maybe more than $1,000 a ton. You know, the company that's been making the most of them has targets of getting down to $600 a ton in the next couple of years. So that's not close to the $100 a ton that we were talking about. But the question then is there a pathway down there? And that's, you know, one thing that my research group has looked at is, are there analogous technologies that have come down in costs like that? And the answer is yeah, for sure. Electric vehicles, solar, wind, they've all done that. So it's possible. The question is, do the characteristics of something like DAC or ocean mineralization or other ocean alkalization or other approaches like that, do they have characteristics that allow you to reduce costs in the way that we've seen for some of these really fast reducing technologies? Or do they look like more like infrastructure projects like highways and subways and nuclear power plants and other things, where even after decades of doing kind of the same thing, the costs are about the same or even going up? So which path we take for doing these probably determines whether we can get down there. And then you have the other kind of more land-based options where cost is not really an issue. And if there is a cost, it's really about the opportunity cost of not growing food, which, you know, might be significant, but it's probably not, the significance is probably not measured in the dollars that the land costs. It's probably in terms of the impact on the populations of subsistence. So yeah, so good question, and that is a good target. $100 seems like a reasonable target.
And as I mean, a variation on what you just said, it's so much the path that we take to get there and how they scale. So, right, I mean, you sort of said there are several things like biochar that are probably there now, but if you tried to scale it by itself, you know, suddenly there isn't enough stuff to turn into biochar, and there isn't enough acres, and the transportation distances go up, and it all becomes very complicated. And you know, we think our earth repair technology, you know, we're trying to build the first plant, but we think we can be below $100 a ton now. But there too, right? I mean, how much can we scale? We can't do it all. We need a whole, you know, the many wedges sort of approach here, that we need a whole bunch of different CDR technologies.
Yep, that's very true. So I will transition to our final question of the night, because unfortunately we are running out of time. And I think this one might be directed best at Rob. So is industrial hemp or hempcrete, which I have never heard of, being considered? Have you heard of that, Rob?
Well, being considered by whom? It's the question. Yeah, I mean, there are people who grow hemp, right, which is not marijuana. It's an industrial crop that we used to make ropes out of, and you can absolutely use that to fortify Portland cement concrete or non-Portland cement concrete and displace some of that emission. It's on a sort of per dollar per ton basis. It's not a huge technology, or it doesn't have a huge impact, and it doesn't necessarily scale terribly well. You know, concrete is used in a huge range of applications that are not, you know, if you were making bricks for your garage and a few other places, it would work fine. You wouldn't necessarily make a superhighway or a skyscraper out of it. So there are limits to how well it can scale, but certainly one of many technologies that, right, you're taking carbon out of the air into the hemp fibers and then into the concrete, displacing some concrete. You know, it works out okay for certain applications, just doesn't scale really well.
Interesting. That was the first time I had heard of that, so I learned a lot there too. Wonderful. Well, we are coming towards the end of our time, and I think this would be a great opportunity if any of you had any final remarks or things you wanted to share or convey with the audience. Please feel free.
Well, thanks for moderating this discussion, Maddie, and thanks for everyone for their comments. I guess I'd just be interested over the next couple of weeks at the UN climate meetings in Dubai, the extent to which carbon removal comes up or doesn't come up, and who brings it up, and what, you know, is there emerging advocacy coalition for it that is working at that level or not? And I don't know, and it'll be interesting to see, to me, if it does come up.
Absolutely. Oh, Rob, did you want to say
No,
something?
I was just going to say thank you also to all of you. I enjoyed your comments, and pleasure to be invited to come and talk.
Of course. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And of course, if you have any additional questions that come up, or if you're interested in any of the panelists' research, I'm sure they'd all be happy for you to reach out to them. So with that, I will hand it back to Allison to wrap us up. Thank you, everyone.
Just one more big thank you, Madeline, for moderating. Thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your expertise, and thanks to everybody who spent their Tuesday night with us. We'll see you all in the new year for our next forum that will take place at the end of January. But thanks, and have a good night, everybody.